You go on to state, and I'll read it. The number is higher than the national average, McDonough said, but corresponds to experts' predictions. When you say that number is higher than the national average, what are you relying upon here as your baseline for that assertion?
In regard to the national average, or in regard to the characterization of the local number? I'm not sure what you're asking me there, Mr. Anderson.
Well, when you're saying that it's higher than the national average, what do you mean?
Right.
And on what do you base that?
Right.
At that time?
Through the 1980s and 90s, actually into the 2000s, I and my colleagues regularly participated in a variety of regional, national trainings, forums, and so on. And so somewhere along the line, perhaps even from the print media, I learned that prediction. Now, I don't recall specifically where I got it from, because I was, as were my colleagues, regularly participating in a variety of trainings and seminars and following literature.
To your knowledge, did the archbishops here or the bishops across the country, in your meetings with them, ever make an effort to compile lists before the efforts made and reported widely in 2002?
Not to my knowledge.
So is it your testimony?
Could I also, well, just while it's on the table, I'm not sure it's implicit, so I don't want to let it get past, that the effort in 2002 was an effort to compile a list, and I think that's inaccurate. It's been an issue, Mr. Anderson, I've had with you for some time, although again in my own head. There was no attempt even then to compile a list. There was a survey to understand the extent of a problem, but not the compiling of a list.
So when did you first see a list?
I'm sorry, what kind of a list?
Of a priest accused or credibly accused of abusing minors.
Right.
In the Archdiocese.
Probably so I was seeing the files regularly, perhaps most every day.
So the question is when?
Yes, throughout the time I worked at the Archdiocese, I saw the files. That was not a list, yeah, but I saw the files which had names on them. Okay.
When did you see a list?
In making his report to the John Jay study, I have a vague recollection that Bill Fallon checked with me to see that we were not missing anybody from the list, or the numbers he was submitting, not a list, but the numbers. And it was in that context that I would have seen whatever compilation he had done.
And when is that?
That would, I don't recall if it was 2002 or 2003.
You told NPR that the Archdiocese didn't have a list of abusers. Was that correct when you told them that?
Yes.
Why wouldn't and why didn't the Archdiocese keep such a list and track who they knew to have been accused of, credibly or otherwise, of abuse before 2003?
So there's two parts to your question. We're talking here about the specific mechanics of a list. We had active files that were regularly accessed by all those who had responsibilities in these areas. So there was no need to compile a list because the information was immediately available.
Yeah, but who has access to all those files? And those files are extremely voluminous. My question is knowing that there are voluminous files, and you say we had access, that doesn't mean a lot of people, right? It just means the Archbishop and his delegates. So my question to you is, why didn't the Archdiocese before 2003 make a conscious decision to determine who those were that had been accused, credibly and otherwise, so that you could know and it could be shared with others that needed to know.
Right. Well, for the latter portion of that, again, my belief then and to today is that that information was widely dispersed among those who had the need to know. And I'll mention that briefly. The files were kept on the main floor of the Archdiocesan office, easily accessible through my secretary or administrative assistant. And in the working files of the individual priests, a card was inserted which indicated there's other information kept under lock and key. See so-and-so to get access to them. So that's in terms of access to the information. I was concerned, I'm guessing the last few months probably convinced reasonable people that this is so. You're talking to a judge about it. Lists just with names on them are notoriously difficult to make accurate, and they imply clarity of information where clarity of information is not existent. I indicated, for example, and I regret this now, of course, looking back, but during the 1990s, we didn't consider Jerome Kern to have actually abused children. Again, I regret that, but I don't think Jerome Kern's name would have shown up on a list had we made a list. So.
Well, if it had been recorded in the file by you or others that he had put his hands upon the genitals of Al Mashad and or similar reports have been made by others, it should have been, correct?
That's certainly my opinion today. Once again, the expert advice we were receiving independent, as I recall a litigation witness for you, was that these matters that were reported about Kern did not constitute sexual abuse of a minor.
For the John Jay study, didn't you or Fallon have to write the names down and find the actual number?
I'm sure that's so, yes.
You make mention of the files. Let me ask you about that. You say these files are readily available to those that need to know. Is that what you said?
I believe that is. We can check the record if you'd like, but it sounds like what I said.
Who are those that need to know about what's in those files?
Well, of course, you're asking the present tense, and so today I'm not in a position to say that. It's been some years since I've been in a position to say that. You want to talk about the past?
Well, let's talk about the files.
Yeah.
First, who needed to know when you were Vicar General what was in those files?
Right. The normal access would have been to the Archbishop, any of the assistant bishops, and there were differing numbers at various times, the chancellors, or anyone they would designate, and there were, I think throughout all the time I was Vicar General, no, for 1 year there was one chancellor, but otherwise there were two. Priest personnel director, or later the clergy personnel director. Communications, any of the folks working with priest benefit matters, the chief financial officer. There may be a few others, but those are the ones I can think of right now.
When you mentioned a priest benefit officer and a CFO, is that because they needed to know because extra payments, there has been a practice of making extra payments to known offenders in the Archdiocese?
I certainly wouldn't characterize our practice that way. If you'd like, I'd characterize it the way I would, but I don't agree with you in the characterization.
Well, Capone was receiving extra payments, wasn't he?
Capone was receiving transitional assistance.
And he's not the only that was receiving extra payments who was known to have been an offender, was he?
I'm disputing your characterization of extra payments. I will stand by my characterization of transitional assistance, and it is correct, as you assert, however, that Capone is not the only one.
And how many accused or known offenders were receiving additional funds beyond the ordinary provided a priest.
Right.
How many?
I don't know the number. Any priest who was removed under the Charter for the Protection of Children and Youth received some sort of transitional assistance. Beyond that, it had been our practice for many years that any priest leaving the priesthood for just about any reason whatsoever received transitional assistance. So fellows who were leaving, priests who were leaving because of psychological disability, depression, alcoholism, we would assist them as well in making their transition.
Were you aware, Father, that there's a separate account kept at the Archdiocese where payments are being made to offenders and accused offenders for additional assistance?
For transitional assistance, yes, I was. I think
515 account, you recall that?
Might be 1515.
1515.
Believe we did that at the direction of the Finance Council so that they would know what the activities were.
And that was a practice begun in what year?
I believe in the context of the Charter, but I don't recall that specifically. We may have accounted for it separately before then.
Was that discussed in Finance Council minutes?
I don't recall if it appeared in minutes or not.
Was it discussed in Finance Council?
I'm guessing it probably was. I don't recall that specifically.
Do you have actual knowledge that beyond yourself, the Archbishop, the auditor, and the CFO, anybody else knew that such payments were being made to these known offenders?
Yes. Well, I shouldn't say actual knowledge. I can speak to the likelihood, but I don't have actual knowledge.
Let's go back to the files for a moment. Okay. When you talk about the files that people that needed to know had access to, and you've identified those, what files are you talking about when you said that the Archbishop and all these other people you identified had access to concerning the offenders?
The files I would have characterized then, I believe, I certainly characterize today, as files about disciplinary matters.
Okay, now, name the files, though, that you're talking about. What do you call those files?
I call them the disciplinary files.
And in your discussions with your colleagues who have knowledge of these files, is that what you called them when you referred to them? Because we need a name here.
Right. Well, I'm calling them disciplinary files. I don't recall what. I've heard some people refer to them some years ago as restricted files.
Well, there are priest files that are the ordinary personnel matters that pertain to assignments and any, all matters pertaining to where they are and what they're doing and all that kind of stuff. Those are maintained, are they not?
They were during my time, yes.
And they're called just priest files. Is that correct?
That would be the term of art, I presume, something like that.
And you're referring to another category of files called disciplinary files, correct?
That's correct.
And the disciplinary files contain what?
Okay, so again, recognize you're talking in the present tense. I've not worked in these matters with any authority since 2008.
Well, let's talk about if you have. Well, you were the delegate for safety in 2008. You'd accessed the files since then, haven't you? I mean, that's your role.
Actually, generally, I did not make access. Whether I had access or not, I don't know. My fundamental responsibility after June 15th of 2008 was the prevention programs. So I probably did have access. I don't recall that I ever attempted to access after 2008.
Well, as a delegate for safe environment by the Archbishop in 2008, and for the years that you were, doesn't it seem important to know about what has happened in the past as reflected in files to know what to do to prevent it in the future? I mean,
Of course, most of my work was in regard to our educational efforts.
monitoring?
Well, hold on a second. 80,000 or so kids each year receiving safe environment training, to the work of publicizing our activities within church and letting people know.
Okay, so
and
let me
also
just,
monitoring.
Let me just,
Yeah.
I don't want to be rude, but
Yes.
I have limited time, so I don't want to,
Okay.
I need to, so you didn't go back to the files after 2008, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. So, the disciplinary files contain what?
They would include whatever reports we'd made and were made to us, archdiocesan officials, and then what we did about those reports. They might include press clippings and a variety of other things as well. Everything relevant to the complaint about disciplinary problems.
And where would anything that would be deemed to be scandalous under canon law be maintained?
I don't know that there's a particular determination under canon law of scandal.
Well, 489, Section 489 of the Code talks about the maintenance of archives for
Okay.
scandalous materials, does it not?
I don't recall the specific use of that term, but you're probably referring to the canons, which would be in the 300s somewhere, about secret archives.
Yes. So are the secret archives a part of the disciplinary file or separate?
I don't believe the Archdiocese has maintained, at least when I was Chancellor, we did not maintain. When I was Vicar General, we did not maintain secret archives.
So the files that you said that those that needed to know would be the disciplinary files that you're referring to?
Correct.
Any other files?
There are probably multiple files on priests. There's the main files in the vault, which include a reference to this other. The priest.
My interest, of course, are the files pertaining to priests who offend kids. So you know what we're talking about.
All right,
here.
good.
I'm not talking about other matters. We're
Their
talking
pension
about
matters and
child
that sort of thing.
safety, child protection, prevention, and or failure to do so. So when it comes to kids and priests abusing kids, and the files maintained by the Archdiocese, you say there are disciplinary files apart from the priest file, correct?
Correct.
And they're maintained by whom?
Well, again, past tense now, because I haven't been involved with that since 2008. They were maintained by the Chancellor's office and by me, mostly by my administrative assistant, Judy Delaney. The file, but let me go to your specific question about child abuse
Okay,
matters.
first, two different
Yes.
locations are you talking about then? The Chancellor's office and by you?
No, you said by whom. So yes, two different group of people would
Okay.
send materials there maintained.
Okay.
The,
Now, just a minute. I gotta get this file understood, so we're talking about the same thing.
yes.
There are files in the Chancellor's office, right?
There are files in what's in common chancery practice referred to as the vault.
The vault.
The vault,
Okay.
and the vault is, if you will, owned, and I'm putting that between quotation marks, owned by the Chancellor's Department.
Okay. And basically, under canon law, the vault, isn't it just the Archbishop and his designee have access to the vault?
Those folks do, and pretty much all the staff working there would have access as they needed.
Is there a file or files maintained that are designated secret?
Not during my time. I can't say what's happened in the last 6 years.
Were there files maintained designated restricted?
These are the ones I call disciplinary. Some might have referred to them as restricted.
And they are restricted to whose eyes?
You know, that's
Those you named, or more
basically
limited?
those I named. But again, restricted is less a matter of who can see them. It's simply that to have access to them, one would have to go through another person. So one would not access them all by him or herself. That's the restriction's not so much about who, it's simply about how, in my time. It's a nice tie, by the way.
Where were the disciplinary files kept?
I don't have a specific memory for all of the years, but largely during the majority of the time that I was there, they were kept in my secretary or my administrative assistant's office.
That's Judy Delaney?
Judy Delaney, yes.
And were there files that were restricted pertaining to sexual abuse kept any place else?
Probably two other places, not restricted. One is that some of that material remained in the general file of a priest. And then when priest died, sometime in the year or two after his death, his file would be transferred to what was often referred to as the downstairs vault. It was simply a locked archives room in the basement. And so those files also would have materials related to a priest.
Only those that were deceased. Is that your belief?
That was the practice in my time.
Did Archbishop Flynn maintain separate files in a fireproof closet or cabinet?
Not to my knowledge.
Did you keep files on your own in someplace?
I often had working files, and I tried with some regularity then to clean those and send the material to the vault or to the Chancellor's Department for their assignment.
Did you keep files that you did not share with others or direct into either the vault or the disciplinary file?
No.
Did you have the practice of taking notes of various reports and then destroying the notes?
My practice was to not maintain loose paper floating around. That's what you mean. The very extensive Archdiocesan files, because I'd been their supervisor for a number of years, I'd come to recognize there was a very extensive documentation, a lot of which I think you've shared over the years.
Were the disciplinary files kept under lock and key?
They were.
And who had key?
The key was kept in the top middle drawer of Judy Delaney's desk.
And who knew it was there?
All of the people I've just mentioned. And their secretaries.
Before 2008, did you use email?
Very, very little.
Why not?
I didn't consider myself competent. I had very extensive secretarial support, but that began to change in the last 18 months or so that I was Vicar General. We went through a very significant staff downsizing. And so I believe it was in the context of that downsizing, sometime in 2007 or 2008, that I learned to use email.
Are there any other files pertaining to childhood sexual abuse and priests and records of that maintained by the Archdiocese, to your knowledge, that you have not identified either by name or location?
Again, given that I don't know what the current practice is, I have to direct answer to your question is no.
Okay. What about electronic files? How then are they stored and kept?
That practice, the issue of electronic filing was very, very nascent when I was Chief of Staff, and I don't recall that any determination was made about that at the time.
Was it, at some point in time, did you stop keeping electronic copies or printed copies of emails because you were concerned about them being discovered?
Oh, okay, so let me say, underlying fact, I don't recall ever keeping paper copies of emails.
Would you have Judy print them out?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you direct that they be put someplace?
I'd use them as needed and either destroy them or send them to the file.
And did you at some point express the view that you chose to destroy some of those because you believe they could be or may be discovered in litigation?
I don't believe I did, no.
Did anyone ever tell you that they were going to do that or you should do that?
I don't recall that. I don't recall anyone ever telling me that. I do have a recollection from a friend in the 1980s who told me, never destroy records from a file because records archaeologists can reconstruct them. And that became, for me, a kind of an operating principle from 1987 or 8 on, that it was better to have as full a file as possible.
Any other files? When you developed the Archdiocese developed a monitoring program, have there been files that were developed specific to it?
Do you know, I don't
Yes
know.
or no?
I don't know that. No.
You were in charge of the monitoring program, weren't you?
I was supervised the fellows, yes.
Okay, and you have been the supervisor or had been the supervisor for how many years?
From the initiation of the program, I began in 2004 or 5 until last September. That is September of 2013.
And in 2013, what happened that caused you not to have the responsibilities concerning child and sexual abuse you had for so many years before?
I'm grateful to say that finally Archbishop Neinstedt followed through on his promise that he would find a replacement for me.
Did you ask for out of this whole thing because of the pressures?
You know, not particularly, because when I stepped down as Vicar General, which happens always at the change of an administration, Archbishop Neinstedt, asked me to stay on as his Vicar General for a very short period of time. He'd already determined who the new Vicar General would be. He also asked that I would assist the Archdiocese with the safe environment matters until he would name a successor. From time to time, I checked with my colleagues to see how we were doing on getting me a successor. But my concern was not primarily volume.
Were the files kept on those priests that were being monitored? Yes or no?
I don't know what the practice was.
Going back to, did you keep any?
No. Well, correction. I may have kept notes when I had a meeting to make sure I followed up. I don't think I kept those sorts of things in a file. When I would send recommendations to Archbishop Neinstedt in the last few years, I sometimes kept files, no consistent pattern in that regard.
Did you yourself keep any documents, files, or records pertaining to sexual abuse apart from those maintained by your secretary, Judy Delaney?
No.
Or her successor was Patty, wasn't it?
No, her assistant was Patty.
Assistant was Patty.
I was fortunate to have 2 assistants. Those were the days.
So you kept nothing yourself?
That's correct.
Okay. The payments to the priests accused of sexual abuse, I think the account that included that was 1-515. Does that sound right?
In my mind, I have 2 accounts, 1515 and 1516.
One was for childhood sexual abuse and one was for adult exploitation.
Adult exploitation and other behavioral issues.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the childhood sexual abuse account. You're aware that they were paid extra and monies out of this account, and these were priests identified as having sexually abused kids, correct?
There's a lot of things mixed up in your question. I will say this. We set up the account because we were being asked to let the Finance Council and from time to time the general public know what we were spending on these problems. So the 15, whichever one it was, and I can't remember which one was 1515, which one was 1516. What we tried to do is include in there all transitional help to these fellows. I believe, payments for counseling for victims or other pastoral care for victims, probably legal settlements, although that may have been elsewhere. I don't know that portion of it. But what we were trying to do is to provide as full an accounting as possible of the financial costs of our dealing responsibly with clergy's sexual misconduct with minors. The parallel account was for all the other special assistants to priests, some of whom had offense histories of one sort or another, stole money, for example, others of whom simply were psychologically incapable of continuing their work.
And how many accused offenders are receiving these payments out of this account? Offenders of childhood sexual abuse.
Do you have a specific time in mind? I don't know what the current practice is.
At the time that you were involved in these accounts being maintained and payments made.
Right. Early on, 2002 or 3, in the implementation of the charter, I would be surprised if any of the priests we'd identified, or by then former priests we'd identified, was not receiving help. That was part of the process we used, was transition. Now, those transitional payments were to have ceased at various timing with different priests. Of course, you may have heard, and this after my time, but we discovered that one of our employees at the Archdiocese was stealing funds.
That was the auditor, right?
I think he was the controller.
Okay.
Was stealing the funds.
Did you have discussions with him about these accounts and concerns raised by him about whether the fact that these offenders were being paid?
Never did, which surprised me because he claimed that. Let me just, if I could just finish the thought I was on, Mr.
Well,
Anderson.
I guess the answer to the last question was you didn't have any discussions with him about that?
That's correct.
Okay.
I would just finish up this.
Well, which question are you answering?
I'm the last one before that, about payments. You
okay.
asked about during the time I was responsible.
Okay. How many, the question was, how many were being paid?
How many? Yes. So, as I say, initially in 2002 or 2003, probably everybody. I don't know the exact number at this point, probably everybody. Those payments were to have diminished, and then the fellow would either become self-supporting or be paid from his accrued retirement benefits. Somewhere along the line, and I believe our felonious thief may have been involved with this, some of my agreements with these priests and former priests appear to have been countermanded, but I have that third party. I don't have that directly myself. So I don't know how many were paid. My guess is more than I authorized.
What do you mean by that what did you say?
Countermanded.
Countermanded, what do you mean?
That my suspicion is, that someone in the finance office continued payments, charging them to those accounts, but may or may not have been paying them to the individual men. This is purely my suspicion. So I can't give you an accurate number, summary, conclusion of my answer to you.